Light Yagami and Nier. Two characters who are far more similar than you think. They are both obsessed with the idea of justice and use their positions to uphold it. However, their similarities diverge when the question of how far should one go to uphold said justice comes into question. Nier is considered to be the true successor of L, with enough potential to take on the god of the new world, who defeated L in the first Battle of Pride. But was Light's battle against Nier ever close to begin with? Did he just lose to plot, or was Light doomed from the start? We're going to go over every point in the series in which Light and Nier faced off, while it's also going over some new perspectives that not many people seem to realize regarding these two enigmatic individuals. If you enjoy Death Note content, make sure to subscribe, because as I said, we're going to dive into the narrative behind this battle alongside the scaling, so make sure to show support as I do like making these. Before we actually get into Light and Nier's first encounter, we do need to go over what Nier was up to during the intermission of Death Note, or in simpler terms, right after part 1 and the time skip that ensues. Roger has informed Nier and Mello of L's death and requests that they work together. Nier is completely on board, but Mello refuses. His emotions are running high and his inferiority complex takes the will as he's reminded of how much better Nier is than him. He forfeits his right to succeed L and hands it over to Nier on a silver platter before deciding to leave Wami's house at only 15. At this point in the story, Nier is only 13 years old. Narratively speaking, he's the smartest student at Wami's house, constantly acing its aptitude tests with no sort of difficulty whatsoever. It's so easy for Nier that he finds much more entertainment in playing with toys and puzzle pieces as opposed to learning the curriculum at Wami's house. This is pretty crazy, as you have to keep in mind that this is an institution that's dedicated to raising child prodigies and making them either competent enough to succeed L or excel in a field of their own choosing, like Linda, who decides to pursue art. I don't think I need to go into extensive detail as to how cracked you'd need to be in order to not only qualify to succeed L, but be handpicked by the man himself, who's not only the greatest detective in the world, but as far as we know, the smartest person on the planet. Nier proceeds to inherit L's fortune and gets to work, but it's not going to be easy. Right before he died, Watari deleted all known data related to the Kira case, which means that Nier has to start from scratch, because it's never stated verbatim as to how Nier even figured out about the existence of a notebook. There are theories that suggest that, alongside the message that L sent to Wami's house after his death, it also included case files that would bring Nier and Mello up to speed, although it does seem to be in character for L, but it's a theory. So how does Nier even start, let alone find a lead? Well, if you read between the lines in chapter 60 of the manga, you'll be able to figure it out. Let me explain. On March 5th, 2009, Nier, accompanied by the director of the FBI, has a meeting with the current president of the United States. Nier presents his findings pertaining to the Kira case and explains that on October 28th, 2004, L publicly stated that he approached a man suspected to be Kira, who we all know to be Kyosuke Higuchi. He was surrounded by policemen, but strangely died on the scene, though this doesn't deny the fact that he previously had possessed the power to kill based on previous victims. Nier points out that the murder notebook can provoke death as long as a person's name is written in it. He then specifically states that at the time of Higuchi's arrest, an officer on the scene heard him mention a notebook that kills whoever's name is written down, as long as you can recall what they look like. Nier also remarks that an object resembling a notebook was taken away from Higuchi's car to a helicopter, which left the scene soon after. Based on Nier's words, we can come up with two conclusions as to how he figured out the existence of the notebook. One, Nier was able to directly access the MPA case files and go over them, which is how he found out about L's statement. There's no reason as to why this info would be hidden from the police, as those in the MPA were aware of the Kira case, his existence, and L. Two, Nier directly interviewed the police officers present at the scene of the crime, and no, I'm not referring to the task force that include characters like Aizawa, Matsuda, Ide, and Mogi. I just mean the other police officers that helped the task force apprehend Higuchi, as there were multiple cars filled with policemen that came to lend a helping hand to the task force. It's possible that Nier did a combination of both, or one and the other. But how was Nier able to figure out the location of the notebook? Well, simple. It's very likely that Nier knew L was on the helicopter, and his last known location was in Japan, which is also where the MPA headquarters are. Since the MPA were involved in the Kira case investigation, its location is now in Japan. Whether you like him or hate him, you have to respect the grind. With zero leads and absolutely no context other than finding a killer who can kill with only a name and face, Nier was able to pinpoint and discern all the specific details needed to get a solid start on the Kira case investigation. Aside from figuring out the existence of the notebook, he presents a briefcase filled with years worth of data on the Kira case investigation. This logically impresses the president, and he decides to make Nier Near head of his own team, titled the Special Provision for Kira, or the SPK for short. But why does Near need a team? Can't he solve this case by himself? It's directly stated in Death Note How to Read that although Near is a genius, he struggles by himself. He lacks social skills and social knowledge, barely interacts with anyone, and basically checks all the boxes of a disabled person to some extent. In order to bring out his true powers, he needs the support of a competent team around him. It's certainly an odd prerequisite, but you'll soon come to find out why the SPK was necessary in part 2. But now that we've gone over how Near located the notebook, it's time to talk about his first encounter with Light Yagami. And just as a small note, since Light has now taken on the role of L, I'll be referring to him as L2 in order to not confuse him with the original L. The MPA director is kidnapped by the Mafia, led by Mello, and eventually Deputy Director Yagami's daughter is kidnapped. They have agreed to give her back as long as the MPA hands over the notebook. Light decides to ask for their assistance regarding Takemura's murder investigation, which is when Near decides to intervene. He flips on the voice changer and mockingly greets Light, referring to him as L number 2. This shocks Light, since no one in the world should know that the real L is dead, and he attempts to feign ignorance. However, Near says it's futile and explains they are a new group known as the SPK, tasked with capturing Kira without L's help. Not many people seem to take into account how nervous Light is. He's so nervous and intimidated by Near's presence that he not only refers to it as a strange feeling, but in the anime, Light's wrist is visually chained to L, which represents his influence still existing to this day. Even though he is dead, his work is being carried on by his successors. This is what Light has misunderstood. Defeating L would never be the end. As long as Wami's house existed, there would always be another person to take his place. Near makes it clear that the FBI and CIA will no longer be operating under L2's control, and that his orders will have priority over L2's. Near then accepts L2's offer to cooperate, confidently stating that solving Takemura's murder will lead to the arrest of Kira. Light is completely thrown off guard by Near's confidence, stating that it's reminiscent of him, with the him obviously being a reference to L. Because what is part 2 of Death Note without L glaze? Near picks up on L2's hesitance and cheekily asks him what is wrong. After all, it's odd that such a simple statement would have him so quiet. Pride and ego aside, at the end of the day, they both want the same thing, the defeat and capture of Kira. So why does that make L2 silent? Light quickly locks back in and decides to reveal that Deputy Director Yagami's daughter has also been kidnapped. Near is immediately on top of things, as he declares that he will gather as many agents as he can and uses a satellite to watch over LA. Shockingly, however, he decides to let L2 have full authority over the mission to recover Sayu Yagami before he hangs up the phone. The SPK is extremely confused about Near's decision to let L2 handle things, as he's shown nothing but incompetence for the past few years. However, Near points out that he's not banking on him to succeed. He's hoping that he remains incompetent because it'll be far easier to manipulate him. The current goal of the SPK is to capture Kira, but that will be difficult without gaining possession of the notebook. Near knows that the MPA has its back against the wall, as they are desperate to get back Sayu, so they will undoubtedly trade the notebook. Therefore, the best thing to do is to sit back, offer support, and watch it all play out. But that's the thing. Near quite literally sits back and lets the whole thing play out. He does what he can, but it's obvious that Near wasn't going all out due to the later feats he performs. He kinda just lets Mello take the notebook without a fight, though he does tell Light that even if the roles were reversed and he was leading the operation, there wouldn't be much that he could do, because the kidnappers were fully prepared. After Mello orders the Mafia to execute members of the SPK, Near begrudgingly decides to cooperate with the task force, trading info regarding Mello in exchange for the knowledge of the notebook. However, Near has no means of fully cooperating and actually finesses Light into getting free information regarding the notebook. In exchange for the rules, he gives up the name of the mastermind behind the kidnapping, who we know to be Mello, and even the orphanage in which he grew up in. It was a bit of a risk, as even L2 could retrace him back to the orphanage, but Near does the advantage. L2 doesn't know what he looks like, nor does he know his real name. The same goes for Mello, and so on. It's a very minor trade that leads to Near gaining more progress. However, Light makes sure to leave out crucial information that'll give Near the advantage, specifically Shinigami, the eyes, and the ownership of the notebook. Near then proceeds to help Light track down Mello's whereabouts based on the killings that have been committed by his gang around America. From here, Near takes the backseat approach. He simply observes from the shadows and collects data. He's like a machine. His program will continuously run until a solution is found. During Light's rematch against Mello, Near notices several strange things. Most notably, in chapter 64, Near is surprised at how fast L2 is able to figure out the name of the man who accompanied Sricho to board the flight. This sort of surprise may be seen as odd, since since L2 is, well, L, the greatest detective in the world. Figuring out anyone's identity should be child's play for him, but it's clear to Nier and the SBK that L2 is incompetent and nothing like his predecessor, the original L. Therefore, he shouldn't have been able to perform such a feat, because it works against his reputation. There's been no sort of progress made in the Kira case since L's death, and yet L2 is flawlessly able to do something like figure out a criminal's identity, which I can't stress enough is an extremely impressive feat considering the time period they're in. Remember, L2 requested that all police and media refrain from making criminals' faces public. This was taken into worldwide effect just 2 weeks after L's death. Nier hasn't outright said it, but in the back of his mind, he's beginning to wonder if L2 has some sort of connection to Kira. In chapter 71, Nier follows the media's report of the first raid orchestrated by L2. However, he notices that the soldiers' helmets were cleanly cut off. But why just the helmets? If the enemy has the means to do such a thing, wouldn't it be better just to straight up kill them? It's quite a stretch, but not so much when you remember the existence of such a thing like the Death Note. This leads Nier to deduce that the Mafia has access to other supernatural means aside from the notebook itself. This would obviously be Sido, the Shinigami's doing, but Nier had no idea that they existed up until this point, which makes it that much more impressive for him to be already surmising about gods of death. In chapter 75, right after Shucho's death, Nier persistently grills Light for answers, but gets the same response every time. Kira helped us. But why? Why would Kira help the MPA uncover the address of the Mafia's hideout, which would then lead them to regaining the notebook? Wouldn't it make more sense for Kira to take it back? There are so many rules to the notebook, which Kira would inevitably want to keep a secret. Even more strangely, L2 somehow knew that every member of the Mafia was going to die on November 10th. His reasoning? Kira contacted the task force and told them everything. Nier knows it's complete BS, and believes that L2 is pulling the strings of the MPA, manipulating them into following Kira's lead in order to get the notebook back. There's also the question of how Kira just somehow knew that the MPA originally had possession of the notebook, as well as its location. You can't just say, oh, Kira knew because he's omniscient, as that actually works against him. If Kira is all-knowing, the notebook would have never been taken by the MPA or Mafia. If he's that powerful, why not just threaten the MPA into giving the notebook back? Lastly, L2's pride and ego. It's logical, but also illogical. Why was he so cold and evasive? Why did he refuse to work with the SBK? One could argue that L2 is prideful and wants to solve it by himself, but Nier is excellent at reading a person's psychological profile. He didn't get the vibes of a persistent and determined detective. He got the vibe of someone who wants to be secretive. The only conclusion that Nier could make is that L2 and Kira are connected. He instructs the SBK to investigate immediately, but nothing changes until Mello arrives. Nier knew he'd be meeting with him eventually, but didn't expect that it'd be so soon. After a bit of back and forth between them, Mello graciously gives Nier information that'll assist him on the investigation. This includes the confirmation of the existence of Shinigami. Whoever touches the notebook can see said Shinigami, and one of the rules in the notebook is fate. He refuses to elaborate further and takes his leave, which leads to Nier beginning to brainstorm. Nier uses process of elimination to determine that the fake rule is the 13-day rule. It's the most likely to be fake based on the past murders and the information given to him by L2. With new knowledge in his hand, Nier decides to make a move, calling up L2 to discuss his new findings. It's refreshing to finally see Nier take the aggressive approach, but it also highlights the underlying flaw of Nier. He's unbalanced as a detective and a strategist. This is mainly due to the fact that he represents half of L, the calm and calculative side that sits back, crunches the numbers, and does all the heavy brain work. Notice how whenever Mello's presence is known, Nier finally makes a move, but it's not based on Nier's own decision. It's because Mello quite literally spurs him into action. The hot-blooded successor represents the initiative and willingness to act that L has. He has the ingenuity, boldness, and bravado to pull off daring plans that most would see as out of the question. However, Nier knows that he lacks the motivation and determination that L and Mello possess. But he doesn't self-reflect. He simply acknowledges it and pushes on, working around his flaws and basically attempting to brute force his way into solving the puzzle. But that is wrong. Nier needs Mello just as much as Mello needs Nier, a fact that neither of the two are able to acknowledge until the very end. But it's more evident when you look back on the story. Without Mello, Nier wouldn't have figured out the 13-day rule was fake or known about Shinigami. But without Nier, Mello would have been arrested or killed. Nier and Mello's struggles don't make them any less worthy to be a successor to L. It more so paints a realistic viewpoint on the pressure that one has to succeed the person who came before them. It's also a testament to the shoes that one has to fill, as L was one person who was capable of bringing out the calm and aggressive sides of himself without getting burnt out. He could multitask and do it all. So in summary, L was the GOAT, and Nier and Mello's struggles are quite realistic. Back to the story, however. Nier immediately confronts Light with his newfound knowledge and catches him completely off guard. He asks Light to tell him which of the rules within the notebook is most likely to be fake, which immediately corners Light. He only has two options, and none of them are pretty. He can either A, lie to Nier and say none of them are real, which is quite literally confirmation that he is Kira. His insistence on the validity of the rules would be deemed as suspicious, especially because Nier has legitimate reasons to consider that one of the rules is fake. B, agree with Nier's hypothesis and pick the rule that is most likely to be fake, which is the 13-day rule. However, if Light does this in front of everyone, it will cause him to lose the biggest edge he had on the entire task force, which proved his innocence. Remember the memory loss plan? Light has no choice but to pick B. However, he does so with a twist. Ryuk is now visible to everyone inside of Task Force HQ due to touching the notebook, and he asks Ryuk to confirm the validity of the 13-day rule. Ryuk says it's real, but this only sinks Light into a deeper hole. Nia can't help but smile at Light's desperation to conceal the truth as he asks if the task force and L2 ever saw the original L's face. Light is so shocked by Nia's questions that he temporarily cuts off the call, which only confirms Nia's suspicions. After talking to the task force and letting them know that Nia suspects one of them to be Kira, he calls back Nia and confirms his question. This leads Nia to deduce that it's strange that Kira killed L but spared everyone on the task force. Light argues that the task force has been through multiple situations in which one of them was suspected to be Kira, even going as far as to ask if Nia really believes Mello over a Shinigami, to which Nia immediately says he does. He then concludes that Kira is amongst the task force and making the Shinigami lie on his behalf. Matsuda is confused on why all of this is such a big deal, as Aizawa reminds Matsuda that the 13-day rule was what proved Light's innocence. The rule states that if you use the notebook but fail to write another name past 13 days, you will die. Light was in prison for over 50 days and he survived, which means that he couldn't have been Kira. But if the rule was fake, it reopens the investigation on Light. His only saving grace is Shuichiro Yagami's dying words prior to his death. Shuichiro gained the eyes, which allow you to see the real name and lifespan of everyone. However, if you can't see the name and lifespan of a notebook user, then they are Kira. Shuichiro saw Light's name and lifespan, which meant that he couldn't be Kira. If you're confused on how Light pulled this off, I mean, it's explained in the story. He basically kept Misa's notebook against his skin, which prevented him from losing ownership of the other notebook. Either way, Light has lost this round. Nia was far too aggressive and is slowly whittling away at Light's credibility. Although the task force don't openly jump on Light, it's clear that Aizawa and Ide are starting to grow suspicious of him. This infuriates Light, who makes the rash decision to perform a counterattack, uses his influence to contact Demigawa, giving him the address of the SBK headquarters, which is then leaked on live television by Demigawa, who incites a riot amongst the Americans. Light was able to get Nia's address via secretly tracking Mogi, who was tailing Mello. He pinpoints the exact area he stops in and uses it to triangulate Nia's position. Nia is infuriated by Light, which Light warns him to evacuate SBK headquarters before it's too late. He knows he's lying for his teeth, and the likelihood of his being Kira is even more obvious. It's too coincidental for the SBK to be raided after Mogi's arrival, as only a handful of people know about the SBK's location. Nia outright says that Light plans to kill him and then dispose of the task force once Nia is done. He urges everyone around Light to at least consider the possibility of him being Kira, which only Aizawa remotely believes. However, Light doesn't care, because in his eyes, Nia is dead. All he has to do is wait until the rioters storm the building and kill Nia. If he somehow escapes, Misa is currently watching the camera that Demigawa has aimed below and will use her eyes to write down Nia's name. But what Light doesn't anticipate is Nia casually tossing out L's fortune to the people below, which is a lot, by the way. He uses the money to cloud their judgment and causes them to stop rioting, taking all the money. The police arrive in riot gear, and Nia decides it'd be best to blend in with them, suiting up and even wearing a helmet, which will keep him safe from Kira. All Light can do is watch as Nia exits the building and the mob eventually disperses. By the next day, Nia has relocated to a new HQ, meaning that Light has utterly failed. He can no longer track Nia, and even worse, the entire task force is suspicious of him. But what's going on with Light? Why is he moving so sloppily? If you compare the plans of pre-timeskip Light and post-timeskip Light, the two are generally incomparable, which is crazy to say, even though post-timeskip Light should be far smarter than his teen self. Part 1 Light's creativity had no end, and with every new challenge he faced, he was coming up with even greater plans. Part 2 Light just seems to be bored of it all and half-assing his duties until Nia and Mello arrive. He somewhat tries, gets outsmarted, crashes out, and exposes himself even more, just like he did with the Demigawa plan, which in all honesty was a dumb move. Let's break apart Light's plan piece by piece in order to gain more understanding and perspective. To start, there was barely any planning, thought, or detail that went into it. This was done purely based off emotion. Light was angry that Nia had practically exposed him in front of the task force and mocked him for it. Light planned to have Kira supporters raid the SBK HQ in order to expose Nia's face on live television so Misa could kill him, along with the other SBK members. Not only does it just sound bad on paper, but at the very least, Light should expect someone like Nia to be prepared to deal with this sort of thing. Even if the scenario isn't the same, Nia should have countermeasures for if the SBK HQ is ever exposed. Light is known to take risks, so the fact that he didn't hesitate to go through with this plan isn't surprising, but he quite literally put all of his hopes into this. The plan failed, and now it makes him even more suspicious than ever. Speaking of suspicion, the timing was just terrible. Only a few days prior, Light figured out where Nia's HQ was. The least he could have done was wait, but he immediately contacts Demigawa and jumps on the opportunity to kill Nier. Pre-time skip Light, however, would choose to wait at least a week before he killed Ray Pemba, despite having the means to take him out at any time. He understood that it would be incredibly suspicious to kill someone he just encountered, but post-time skip Light, he didn't give a damn. Obviously, that still doesn't answer the question. Why is Light so sloppy? Why is he moving so careless? It all boils down to ego. Light's ego was at an all-time high during part 2, and why wouldn't it be? He managed to defeat L, the greatest detective on the planet. He was able to work his way into the task force, become his right-hand man, and then crush him after an intense battle. He managed to accomplish this at the age of 18, whereas L was far older than him and possesses way more experience. L's defeat leads to the creation of the New World. Light goes unchallenged for 5 years. He ruled the entire world between the ages of 18 and 23. There is no one to challenge or oppose his views, so of course his god complex would begin to skew his own sense of self. But part 2 Light, he had quite literally lost the plot. He was unrecognizable to his past self and became obsessed with becoming a god. So obsessed that he contemplated killing Sayu just to regain the notebook. He easily loses his composure, yells at Misa, and responds emotionally to Nier and Mello's provocations. Despite Light's influence over the world, he was being challenged by a child. He found it audacious, and so he underestimated Nier and hardly paid any mind to Mello after he blew himself up. By now, you're all familiar with Light's plan. I've gone over it so many times, but for those who are genuinely unaware, I'll briefly recap it. No matter how much Light underestimated Nier, he knew that he could not exist in his new world. For if he was left alive, he'd constantly be challenged. This is originally why he killed L as well. This leads Light to create one last plan that will grant him his perfect victory. As we know, he chose Mikami to be the hand of God, as Light wasn't able to move freely. He gives him a notebook and even gets Takeda on his side. Nier even agrees to meet with Light at the Yellow Box warehouse on January 28. All he has to do is figure out a way to kill Nier. But how? Well, it's simple. Create bait and let Nier be the fish. Light knows that Nier wouldn't miss out on the opportunity to steal the notebook, and so he creates the pathway for him. He has Mikami publicly use the notebook, despite the fact that he's being tailed by the SBK. This would confirm to them that Mikami's notebook was real, and all they'd have to do is map out his day-to-day habits in order to find the perfect opportunity to steal it. However, that's exactly what Light wanted. Unbeknownst to Nier, however, Mikami was not doing the killings. He'd snap a picture of the criminals and send it over to Takeda, who would then kill them from her residence. The notebook that Mikami was carrying around was a fake. This was done to throw off the SBK and waste their time. Mikami would use the notebook in public, and eventually they'd go to his gym locker and steal it. They would then tamper with the notebook and switch it out with a fake that Nier had Giovanni create. However, Light had Mikami check the notebook every day for tampering. This is why he told Takeda, "I've confirmed it," because he confirmed that the notebook had been tampered. Once Light got a message from Takeda, he knew he had won. This would lead into the final part of Light's plan, which was to have everyone gathered in the Yellow Box warehouse. Mikami would arrive, peek in, and write everyone's name down, and Nier would believe it to be a fake. However, Mikami would bring the real notebook on that day and use it to kill everyone. With no one left in his way, Light can flee the scene and start his reign at the top. Despite his many shortcomings, even you have to admit that this plan is flawless. But it failed. And why? Was it because of the plot? How could Nier possibly figure out Light's plan? Well, we know that it was due to Mello's intervention that Light lost. And he would have won. But despite Mello's last-minute play, this was always going to be Light's fate. His underestimation of Nier, high expectations of Mikami, and his arrogance to believe that Mello's actions were meaningless all led to his defeat. He didn't believe for a second that Mello kidnapping Takeda meant anything, nor did he bother to rethink his plan. He just assumed that both were loose ends, and with Mello gone, Takeda was next. If Light had taken Nier and Mello seriously from the start, part 2 would have gone far differently. And remember, Light just randomly in part 2 just goes, "Now I'm ready to lock in." From a raw IQ standpoint, Nier is above Light, but in overall categories such as strategy and planning and many others, Light is just above Nier. He was consistently able to outsmart and puzzle L, who was the greatest detective on the planet. He did this between 17 and 18 years old and only grew smarter. You also have to remember that Light would have won if not for Mello. He solidly outsmarted Nier and technically had the victory in his palm, but was dealt a bad hand. Part 2 Light isn't dumb. He's exceptionally intelligent. Just look at the flawless plan he did, right? That's when Light is actually locking in, but his emotions and ego cause him to make stupid mistakes that look idiotic from the outside in. But as I said earlier, none of this would have happened if Light had just taken Nier seriously. Light's hubris was always going to be his downfall, but he needed to have that flaw. If Light had no ego or hubris, he would have just been a stone cold and intelligent, boring ass character. He'd be plain as a character and lack depth. He'd be a machine, just like Nier. He's not boring though, I'm just saying. But still different, as Nier does have more depth than you'd think, and that's why you should check out my previous videos on extensive analysis of why Light lost and whether or not Nier cheated. You can check in the link in the description for all of that. With all that being said, this ends the video. Take care.